It's HPR, All Things Considered, and I'm Dave Lawrence. Thank you so much for joining us. We are excited because we have a cat at the Blue Note for a series of nights, gets rolling tonight, continues through the 16th, 8 p.m. shows each night for Richard Marx. And I believe, unless I missed something in the short history of the Blue Note Hawaii, this would be his debut here in town. We'll find out now. We've got him on the line. Aloha, Richard. How you doing, brother?
Aloha, Dave.
Good to be talking to you, and do I have it right? This is your debut at the Blue Note Hawaii.
It's definitely my debut at the Blue Note. You know, I've played in Hawaii, I think, maybe half a dozen times in the last 30 years, which is not enough as far as I'm concerned. But, you know, I'm really excited about this engagement because, first of all, I hardly ever use that word for when I'm touring because they're usually, it's one night or maybe it's a two-night stand somewhere. But to be able to sort of just chill out and kind of bed down somewhere for multiple nights it's, I shouldn't say this out loud, but it's almost like, I should be doing this for free.
Right.
It's just, it's a pretty good gig.
It's a privilege, too. It's a nice room, and they've had quite a few cats in there, noteworthy cats, so you're going to be in great company. And as we think about this, describe what's in store at these shows.
Well, about 7 or 8 years ago, after decades of touring with different versions of a band. I've had different players and changed different people out for various reasons. Sometimes, if for no other reason than to just play with new blood, And I started doing, about 8 years ago, a solo acoustic show. And the idea of it never, appealed to me terribly because every solo acoustic show I'd ever seen or heard about seemed a little pretentious and a little too serious singer-songwriter. Like that doesn't sound like a fun time for me, on paper. And so I always had kind of an aversion to it. Plus, I think, it was my own insecurity as a player. Of course, I'll do 4 or 5 songs somewhere for a charity event, just me and a guitar or just me and the piano. But the idea years ago of doing a whole show like that was something that I didn't really ever consider. And then I was basically dared into it by my agent at the time. and I said, all right, fine, let's go down and, we'll do a couple of nights in Florida just to kind of try it out. And it just completely changed my life. It changed my life as a performer. It changed my life as a musician, as a communicator. And so over this last 8 years, I played a fair amount of shows with the band, but I do a bunch of these solo acoustic shows, and it's like a party. It's like if you just came over to my house and I poured us some martinis and I had a guitar there and I was like, oh, dude, let me tell you the story about when I wrote this song.
Right.
And, I've been around a long time. I have some pretty funny stories, and I don't take any of it seriously. It's just a great hang. The best compliment I get always is from, these audiences that say they feel like they hung out with me for a couple hours. That to me is, at this stage of the game, what I'm much more interested in doing. I'm really proud of the body of work. I'm proud of my songwriting catalog, but I want to make people laugh. I want people to just kind of escape and just hang out with me for a bit.
Well, you said a lot of good stuff, and certainly it's a great way to strip the songs down into their bare essence that people appreciate, and like you said, to be able to also have a little bit of a looser time and some fun, and tell stories too. When you talk about telling stories, you also said something about maybe being insecure at some point in your life, and we're talking with Richard Marx. He's in town through Sunday at the Blue Note Hawaii, 8 o'clock shows each night. The history that you've got with music, not a lot of people have. Sometimes people have a background like Mother Ruth, a former singer, Father Dick, jazz pianist, arranger, did commercial jingles successfully, and things like that could influence you. But I read, and you'll share a little bit more, that he had you singing by age 5. So talk about that confidence builder.
Well, the truth is, and my dad he was the most brilliant musician I've ever known. He was obviously a great dad. I miss him dearly, but he was a really, really stellar jazz musician turned jingle writer, producer. And the truth is actually that he wasn't really even the one that got me to start singing commercials. It was this guy that worked for him. He had my dad wrote the lion's share of the commercials, but he was so busy and successful that he had a small stable of writers that he would farm out certain gigs to, and this young guy, his name was Jim Grady. I remember his name. They wrote a commercial for some kid-oriented product or something, and they needed a little boy to sing this jingle. And this guy Jim Grady said to my dad, "Well, I hear Richard singing around the office and Richard singing around the house, singing monkey songs and stuff. Why don't we get Richard to do it?" And my dad laughed and said, "I never would have thought of it." I think he was also afraid of it seeming like nepotism, and so they. It was cool, man. I got to get out of school. I went down into the studio, and that was it, man. It was like lighting a fuse, and I just never wanted to be anywhere but in a studio or on a stage.
That's a great start. I mean, it's and at that age, I would think you'd have just a load of confidence that would come from that. How about, I haven't heard how Mom's former singer background, and we'll talk about how she actually was on your debut record too, but how did she play a role in your earliest years in shaping you to love music?
Well, I mean, both of them really, they were not instructional when it came to music. Everything that I learned to love about not just music in general, but making music and the idea of creating music, just came from watching them, just came from being, from the energy in my house. I was an only child. I am an only child. And so I had, a fair amount of the attention from both of them, but they were also very busy working. But I could see, and they had very different job descriptions. My mom worked primarily for my father and came and sang in groups and solos on the stuff that he wrote. And she sang, her voice is on a ton of famous commercials from the 60s and 70s and 80s. But my dad, he was the one that was, the night before the session, he's home writing the next day's work. He's arranging it. He's producing it. And I could just see the joy that both of my parents had for their occupations. And I'm sure I certainly didn't articulate it in my brain at the time. I was a kid, but that kind of thing permeates your consciousness. And I think when kids, if they're aware of what their parents do, I think a lot of times if you ask a kid, they'd probably say, "Yeah, I watched my dad dreading going to work every day," or "I watched my mom hate her job." I grew up with two parents that couldn't wait to go to work. And that I remember thinking, no matter what I ended up doing, I wanted that. I wanted to spend my life doing something that I really loved doing. And of course, it just turned out to be the same thing that they did, except in a different way. Once I left Chicago and moved to LA at 18 to really pursue the record business, then talk about the fun kicking in. It was like night and day.
Oh, no doubt. And you're a great navigator, because another part of your story is that you have, I mean, not a lot of, sometimes people do have brushes with greatness or they encounter something. You've had this upbringing, which is remarkable, and a real positive one in terms of motivating you to pick a job you liked and your parents leading by example. But then to have the opportunity, and you can explain how it happened because it factors into that move to LA, at least that's what I read. Your demo or a tape of you ends up at 17 in the hands of Lionel Richie, and then he tells you you ought to end up moving to LA or something. Fill us in on how that all went and how it happened.
Well, it was, I had written really only a handful of songs, and because I had the incredible gift of my father's own recording studio. My dad was, his business was booming, and he couldn't, the studios in Chicago really couldn't keep up with his schedule, so he built his own studio, and so I had this place where I could go and record my demos, for the first handful of songs that I wrote that were, that we thought were good enough to even be recorded. And so it was a pretty professional sounding demo. And I knew this guy who knew a guy who knew a guy who knew Lionel Richie. It's 4 people removed. And 6 months later or something, my phone rings and it's Lionel Richie, and he heard the tape. Look, it says a tremendous amount about what kind of man Lionel Richie was and is.
Yep.
He could have, the fact that he even listened to this tape, let alone turned the back of the cassette over. There was I wrote my phone number, pencil, whatever. He called the number for no other reason than to give props to this unknown person on the other end of the line and be encouraging. And, it was very, very complimentary. And I couldn't, I say that I couldn't believe it because it really was mind-blowing that he actually called me. But, for so many years I would tell this story and I'd say I couldn't believe it. But the truth is, and I'd say this without the slightest bit of arrogance, but there was a part of me that believed, almost knew that was going to happen, because I've always had this this sense of things coming true that I believe, that I think. Your thoughts dictate your life, and if you think to yourself, "Well, Lionel Richie's never going to call me," Lionel Richie's never going to call you. I really believed that. As crazy as it sounded, that this tape was going to go from my friend to his friend to the guy to, I believed it somewhere. And that has happened to me my entire life. Pretty much everyone that I've wanted to work with or meet or interact with, they've shown up in my life. And I think you attract that stuff. And, but it doesn't minimize the great fortune that it was. And what a gracious guy Lionel was. So yeah, I abandoned my plan to go to college, and as soon as I graduated from high school, I went out to L.A. and he hired me as a background singer on his first album. So I was kind of off to the races.
Unbelievable. And some great lessons, though. It's a cool thing, interesting. I'm just noticing, talking to you, some great lessons both in employment, the way your folks looked at life, and then this whole thing about positive thinking, I guess, is if you were to distill it down into 2 words. And that's good to hear, because even people who don't have any connection to the music could have a whole lot that they get out of some of the neat things that you've pointed to today. Another one of these early cats who has a role and very different man, but it looks like he really plugged in to your life. And that was Kenny Rogers, another big break, and an artist who's associated with Lionel Richie. Is that what led to Kenny Rogers?
Through Lionel. Lionel Richie and Kenny Rogers. When I met Lionel, he was just coming off of, this incredible boost in his career.
Working with
Kenny. Kenny Rogers, right. He wrote Lady for Kenny Rogers and produced it. And, a lot of people don't know that Lionel wrote Lady for the Commodores to perform, like to put on an album, and the Commodores rejected it. They didn't like it. And so he's like, at the time, I think Kenny Rogers had reached out and said, if you have any songs.
Well, so I have Lionel, one right here.
How about this one? Yeah. Plays in Lady. Next thing you know, it's the biggest song of not just that year, I think of the following 5 years. That song was just monstrous, and it's a classic. And so they had bonded. They created a professional bond and a friendship. And so when I started working with Lionel, he called up Kenny and said, "Hey, I've been working with this kid. He's really fast in the studio. He's a really good background singer." And Kenny was in the midst of, recording a new album. So he said, "Yeah, great, I'll hire him." So he brought me in for a couple of days of background vocal work. And then I just happened to overhear him saying to his producer that he still needed some songs. And so I risked getting fired. It's a good way to get fired, actually.
Sure.
Just, be the background singer and show up with a tape of your songs. But I went for it, and again, I was lucky that Kenny is a gracious guy, and took a minute and sat and listened to what I'd written, and he recorded 3 songs of mine. So that was really how my professional songwriting career was born. So it traces back to Lionel, from 2 years before that.
Yeah, you can see all the roads. I mean, you can trace all the roads all the way back to your parents if anyone's really following this from the beginning of the conversation. And then is that how you hooked with David Foster, which then led to the songwriting credits with like Chicago and Freddie Jackson?
Well, the Freddie Jackson thing was later, and I did work with David Foster for a couple of years, mostly as a background singer. I wrote a song with him for the St. Elmo's Fire soundtrack, and David introduced me to a guy that not only I was a fan of, but ended up becoming my lifelong best friend and my kid's godfather, a guy named Fee Waybill from the band The Tubes.
Yeah, right on.
I was a big Tubes fan, and David was working with them when I met David, and so Fee and I just hit it off, and we've written, I don't know, 50 songs together over the years, and is still like my brother that I never had. My work with David was relatively brief, partly because, at a certain point, it was when his producing career was really kind of taking off with Chicago and a couple other things, and he finally one day point blank just told me that he felt that I shouldn't pursue singing. He actually told me I shouldn't sing. That was his opinion, but I was only 19, and to have a guy, certainly a guy that you admire, that you look up to, basically tell you at 19 to give up your dreams was like, wow. He was encouraging in terms of like saying, you should just be a songwriter. You should just be like me. You should just write and produce other people because you're not a performer. You have no star quality. It was pretty brutal.
Unbelievable.
Yeah. So I think that, maybe at least for the first couple of years of my career, there was a part of me that was, it was a little bit of, I'll show David Foster how wrong he is,
right.
And then I just kind of got over that. But and David and I have done a lot of work together, over the years. And but yeah, he was anything but a factor in my artist career. In fact, he was the only person I worked with that told me I shouldn't pursue an artist career.
And thank gosh that you didn't follow that advice.
Yeah,
and it led to so many great things. That's funny about Fee too, because he's there on your first record, obviously. Another bunch of cats: Joe Walsh, Timothy B. Schmidt, Randy, the Eagles Cats. And was that by then? I guess did Fee play a role in helping you put together the record, or by then you had done a lot of stuff and you were ready to do this on your own?
Yeah, no, I mean Fee was, he co-wrote 2 songs with me and sang some backing vocals. No, but by that point, I had, I had done a lot of work. I had met a lot of people. I created a lot of collaborative relationships, and so when I finally got my record deal, I mean, I say finally like I was slaving away for decades, but it took a couple of years, right, of getting rejected, and then finally met this guy named Bruce Lundvall that ran this label at EMI that I owe him forever. We just lost him a couple of years ago. He was just the sweetest man, and he signed me. And this is another thing. Talk about a show of faith. Bruce Lundvall suggested on my debut album that I produce it myself because he really loved my demos. And he said, why would I force a producer on you when I signed you because I love what I heard.
Wow.
And so I had, this incredible opportunity to go in and make my own record. And I worked with this engineer named David Cole that did my first couple albums with me. And so I had at least, another set of years on the other side of the glass. And he was a seasoned engineer. So, he helped me a lot with some of the technical stuff. But I really kind of was able to be in the driver's seat of my own career from the get-go. And so I cherry-picked the best musicians and got to work with, to this day, I still pinch myself with the artists and the musicians and stuff that I've gotten to work with. It's incredible.
Oh my gosh. I mean, Luther Vandross, Billy Joel, I mean, your list is gigantic. And among those artists that you cherry-picked to be guests on your record, first one was your mom, and she appeared on a few of them too, huh?
I think she sang on the first 3 for sure, and
okay,
maybe even the first 4. Yeah, she sang. I would always make sure that she sang background vocals on at least one song, just to have her name on the record.
And so cool that you banged out the production credit on that too, because that record ended up selling like 4 million copies or something, right? So that's just a whole lot of, wow. I mean, off the bat,
Yeah.
to have
Yeah.
you're producing it and you're singing it and playing. I mean, it's just an epic life. And I mean, Richard has way too many stories for us to pick them all out ahead of these shows. Hopefully, he'll let us talk to him again while he's in town. Again, he's starts tonight. He runs through Sunday, 8 o'clock each night. He's over at the Blue Note. And before we wrap it up, because you've had so many of these remarkable experiences, two final questions before we wrap it up for you today. With all of these star collaborations, have you ever had an encounter that intimidated you because of who you were working with? And also, what would be next in terms of one you'd like to pursue?
Oh, good questions. The first one that comes to mind was I was making my first album. So this would have been 1986. The album came out in 87. And 1986, I was making the first album, but I was completely obsessed with Peter Gabriel and his So album. I was a fan of Peter's before that, but when the So album came out, I remember actually standing outside the record store the morning it was released and waiting for them to open the store so I could get this record. And it still holds up. It's an incredible album, the So album. And so I was pretty obsessed with Peter Gabriel. And a couple months later, I was in a restaurant in L.A., and he walked in with some people and sat down at this table, 5 tables away from me. And I kind of froze, and I was staring, across the room. And my girlfriend at the time was with me, and she said, "You got to go over and you got to say something." And I said, No, I would never do that. I would never go up to somebody like that. It's just so not cool, and I want to give him his privacy. And she said, No, you got to, you're going to kick yourself if you don't. And those situations usually don't end well because, it's like that old thing of like, don't ever meet your heroes, because it's almost always a disappointment. And so I very reluctantly got up, kind of started to head over, and I kind of hung back because I just didn't want to interrupt him. And so then there was this like moment when everybody stopped talking, and he looked over at me, and I profusely apologized for bothering him, and I just said, "Listen, I just want to say thank you for what you do. Your music has meant a lot to me, and I'm grateful that you're on the planet making music." And Peter Gabriel got up from the table and took my hand and put his hand on my shoulder and said, "Oh man, that's so nice of you. What's your name?" And he said, "Are you a musician?" I said, "Yeah, I'm making my first record." He wished me the best. He couldn't have been more kind and warm. And so he was. I've never seen him since then because and that's fine because it was perfection. So that was a great experience.
Glad you listened to that chick you were with, huh?
Yeah, well, yeah, absolutely.
I mean, that was critical advice too, especially because you never ran into him again. And then, what were you going to say about your fave collab that you still haven't done?
I guess the person that keeps coming to mind has been for years and years and years is Rod Stewart, because I've always been a big Rod Stewart fan.
Wow.
And I'm not friends with Rod, but I know him a little bit. We actually did we did a concert together. I opened for him a couple of years ago, but we've never sung together really. We've hung out a little bit here and there, and I know that we've talked about doing something together. And he's still so into making music and performing, and I think that would be a fun thing. I think that would be a fun hang. So I'll go with that, Rod Stewart.
That's a great one. You've got so many amazing stories. It's Richard Marx, and he's through Sunday 8 o'clock shows each night over at the Blue Note. Hope you had fun going through some of your history with us today, Richard.
Yeah, it was a pleasure, Dave.
I really did enjoy it. And if you're up for it, I'd love to come by the thing and record a quick follow-up, but I understand if you just want to make it a vacation and not do any work, no big deal.
No, man, come on by. We'll do something something over at the venue.
Cool. I'll reach out to your cat and firm it up.
Aloha. It's Richard Marx, and it's time to pay up. You are tuned in to member-supported Hawaii Public Radio. It's All Things Considered with my buddy Dave Lawrence. And we're having a pledge drive right now, so give whatever you can, and we all appreciate it.
You're the man. Giving you a hug, a high five. I'll reach out to your cat, Ivan, and thanks. It was great talking to you. You're loaded down with the stories, brother. Really inspiring stuff.
Thanks, buddy. Thanks, man. You have a great rest of your day.
You too. I'll see you when you get here. Take care.
Okay, thanks.